I never thought much about how easily a person could disappear. People vanish every day, and most of us don't even think about it. A news story, a missing person flyer, a face on a milk carton. Someone's gone, but it's just another thing that happens to other people. But I know better now, because I almost became one of those people. It happened in the summer of 2013. I was 29, single, and restless. I'd been working a job I hated in a city I didn't like, and I needed a break. I grew up hunting and hiking, so I figured a solo trip into the wilderness would clear my head. No plans, no distractions, just me and the open land. I packed my truck and headed for a stretch of forest land a few hours away, somewhere remote enough that I wouldn't run into anyone, but not so far that I'd be completely cut off. I had my tent, my rifle, and enough supplies for a week. I figured I'd camp, maybe fish a little, and just get away from the noise of everyday life. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were on winding dirt roads, nothing but trees and hills stretching in every direction. No gas stations, no houses, just the occasional hunting cabin tucked into the woods. By the time I reached a decent camping spot, the sun was setting. I pulled off the main dirt road onto a narrow logging trail and found a clearing near a creek. It was quiet, peaceful. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and had a quick meal. I remember thinking how perfect it was. No phone service, no city sounds, just the wind in the trees and the rush of the creek. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, but because it was too quiet. I was used to the hum of traffic, the distant sound of sirens, people talking outside my apartment window. Out here, the silence felt unnatural. I woke up every hour, listening to the wind, the occasional crack of a branch. The next day, I hiked deeper into the woods. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, just in case I ran into anything. It wasn't hunting season, but out here you never knew what you might run into. Bears, coyotes, maybe even a mountain lion. I spent most of the afternoon wandering, following old trails, getting lost in the rhythm of my footsteps. That's when I found the cabin. It was old, abandoned looking, hidden in the trees like it had been swallowed by the forest. The windows were broken, the roof sagged, and the door hung slightly open. There was no driveway, no path leading to it. Just an old, rotting structure in the middle of nowhere. I should have turned around, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped inside. Dust covered the floor, broken furniture was scattered around, and the air smelled stale, like mold and decay. A few rusted tools lay on a workbench. An old mattress was shoved against one wall, covered in tattered blankets. It looked like someone had lived there a long time ago, but not recently. Then I noticed the footprints, fresh, in the dust. Someone had been here, recently. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My own footprints were next to them, but these were different. They were deep, like whoever made them had been standing in place for a long time. Watching, I backed out of the cabin, moving slow, careful not to make noise. The forest suddenly felt too big, too empty. I scanned the trees, the shadows between them. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, just out of sight. I made my way back to camp faster than I should have. My heart pounded. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an old hunter passing through, maybe some teenagers messing around. But I packed up camp anyway. I didn't want to spend another night out there. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was starting to set. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the battery, the wires. Everything looked fine, but the truck was dead. Like someone had done something to it. That's when I saw the footprints, leading from the back of my truck into the trees. Not my footprints, someone else's, someone barefoot. I grabbed my rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't alone. I scanned the trees, but the light was fading fast. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The forest felt too quiet, too still. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. Close. I turned toward the sound, my rifle raised. Nothing moved, but I could feel it. Someone was watching me. I had two choices: stay with my truck and hope someone came down that road, or start walking. I chose to walk. I had a rough idea of the direction of the main road, but it was miles away. Maybe 10, maybe more. But I wasn't staying there. I moved fast, keeping my rifle ready. Every few minutes I stopped, listened. Footsteps behind me, light almost careful. Someone was following me. I walked for hours. The moon rose, casting pale light through the trees. The footsteps never stopped. Sometimes they were close, sometimes farther back, but they never went away. Then I saw the cabin. Not the old, broken one I found earlier. This one was different, smaller, newer. A single window glowed with light. I didn't think. I ran. I reached the door and pounded on it. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I turned, raising my rifle. The footsteps had stopped. Silence. Then a figure stepped into the clearing. Tall, barefoot, clothes ragged and torn. A knife in one hand. I raised my rifle, aimed. He smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, creeping grin, like he knew something I didn't. I pulled the trigger. Click. The rifle jammed. The man took a step forward. I swung the rifle like a club, catching him in the shoulder. He staggered, but didn't go down. I ran, skirting the cabin, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until I saw headlights. A truck, parked on the side of the road. I stumbled onto the gravel, waving my arms. The driver, an older guy in a flannel shirt, rolled down his window. "You all right?" he asked. I turned back toward the trees. Nothing. No man. No footprints. Just the wind moving through the branches. I never found out who he was. The police checked the area, found my truck, but no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no cabin. Just my own story and the feeling that I had been watched. I never went back, and I never camped alone again. I had been hunting for as long as I could remember. My father took me into the woods when I was barely 10, teaching me how to track, how to move quietly, how to read the land. It was something that stuck with me. Even after he passed, I kept going year after year, deep into the wilderness. This particular trip was meant to be a simple one. A week alone, somewhere far off the trails, away from the noise of town, away from everything. I needed that kind of solitude sometimes. It helped clear my head. The place I had in mind was a stretch of forest in Montana, miles away from any roads, the kind of place where you could walk for days and not see another soul. I packed my gear carefully, rifle, ammo, knife, enough food to last, though I planned on catching my meals. My tent was small, just enough for me. I traveled light, always had. I drove out as far as the dirt roads would take me, then parked my truck in a clearing that didn't look like it saw much use. The rest of the way had to be on foot. I hoisted my pack over my shoulders, double-checked my rifle, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, the terrain flat, trees spaced out just enough to let the afternoon sun break through. The farther I went, the denser it got. Pines towered overhead, their needles thick underfoot, muffling my steps. The air smelled like damp earth and resin. It was perfect. By the time I reached the spot I had in mind, the sun had dipped low, throwing long shadows between the trees. I set up camp near a creek, close enough for water but far enough that the sound wouldn't mask anything moving nearby. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth, cooked a quick meal, then settled in. The first night passed quietly. I woke early, stretched, and set off. I wasn't looking for anything big. Maybe a deer, something to make the trip worthwhile. I moved slow, taking my time, watching for signs. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, any movement in the brush. I spotted a few signs, but nothing fresh. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. That was the first thing that felt off. I had spent enough time in the wild to know how it should sound. Birds in the trees, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. Even if I scared them off, they came back after a while. But here, the silence lingered. No birdsong, no distant snapping of twigs. Just the wind threading through the branches. I kept moving. Around midday, I found tracks. Hoof prints leading toward a clearing. I followed them, stepping carefully, rifle ready. The tracks were fresh. I moved slow, barely making a sound, easing my way forward until I saw it. A buck, standing in the open, ears twitching. A clean shot. I raised my rifle, lined up the sights. Then it bolted. Not like a deer spooked by a noise, but a full sprint, as if something had sent a jolt of fear through it. I cursed under my breath, lowering my rifle. That was strange. Usually, if they caught wind of me, they'd hesitate, try to figure out what I was. This one hadn't. It had just run. I checked the area, found nothing. No scent of predators, no sign of anything else. Just the quiet. I tried again later that day. Another set of tracks, another deer. Same thing. The moment I had it in my sights, it took off like it had been shot at before. By the time the sun started sinking, I still hadn't managed to take anything down. That was rare for me. I headed back to camp, stomach empty, frustration creeping in. The fire was the only source of light for miles, throwing flickering shadows against the trees. I sat beside it, listening. The wind had picked up, but the silence beneath it remained. No insects, no owls, nothing. Then, just past the edge of the fire's glow, I heard it, a branch snapping. I turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. I waited, breath held. Could have been an animal. A bear, maybe, or a cougar. But something felt wrong. I picked up my rifle and stood, peering into the trees. The fire crackled behind me, the only sound in the night. I stayed like that for a long time, watching, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I sat back down, but I didn't relax. I kept my rifle across my lap, eyes on the tree line. I barely slept. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Not deer, not bear. Human. They weren't mine. I crouched down, studying them. They circled my camp, careful, deliberate. Whoever it was had walked close enough to see me, then backed off. I hadn't heard them. I stood up, scanning the woods. The trees stared back, silent. I wasn't alone out here. I packed my gear quickly. I wasn't about to head back just yet, but I wasn't staying put, either. I moved deeper into the woods, further from where the tracks had been. The feeling of being watched stuck with me, a weight between my shoulders. I hunted again that day, but my focus was split. Every noise, every shadow made my skin crawl. I checked behind me more than I looked ahead. My shots were off, my patience thin. I hadn't felt fear like that before, not out here. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark, rifle in my hands, listening. Then, around midnight, footsteps. Not creeping, not sneaking, walking slow, steady. I gripped my rifle tighter. The footsteps circled my camp, just out of sight. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then they stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. An hour. I didn't move. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke to sunlight. The first thing I saw were the tracks. They led right up to where I had been sleeping, then stopped. Whoever it was had stood over me, watching. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, rifle in hand, and started back toward my truck. I moved quick but careful. The feeling of being followed never left me. I checked behind me constantly, but saw nothing. The miles stretched on longer than they should have, the forest pressing in tight. Then, ahead of me, my truck. I stepped into the clearing, relief washing over me, and then I saw them, near the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. A man, not moving, not speaking, just standing, watching me. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. I didn't turn my back. I walked to my truck, slow, deliberate, opened the door, slid in, locked it. The man didn't move. I started the engine. Headlights flooded the trees. Empty. The man was gone. I didn't waste time. I put the truck in gear and got the hell out of there. Dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until I was miles away. I never went back to that part of the woods. I still hunt, but not alone. Never again alone. It was early October when I decided to take the long drive through the backroads of Montana. I was heading west, planning to cut through miles of isolated land before reaching a town where an old friend of mine lived. I figured the trip would take a full day, maybe longer if the weather slowed me down. The roads out there weren't like highways, just miles of gravel, narrow paths winding through open fields, forests, and stretches of land where I wouldn't see a single house or gas station for hours. I liked that kind of isolation. It gave me time to think, and I preferred driving without dealing with the rush of traffic. The only downside was how empty it all felt. If something went wrong, there wouldn't be anyone around to help. No cell service, no quick way to get assistance. But I'd driven through places like this before and never had any issues, so I didn't think too much about it. The first half of the trip was smooth. The sky was overcast, and the air had that crisp autumn chill, but the weather held up. I passed through a couple of small towns, filled up my tank, and checked my phone before heading into the next long stretch of empty road. I knew this part of the trip would be the longest without any stops. About an hour in, the road narrowed even more. Trees lined both sides, their branches swaying in the wind. The leaves had started turning orange and red, but a lot had already fallen, covering the ground in thick layers. I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes, and the only sounds were my tires on the gravel and the occasional gust of wind pushing against my truck. Then, about 10 miles down the road, I saw something that made me slow down. A truck was parked on the side of the road. It was an older model, dark blue, covered in dust. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I pulled up beside it and stopped. The truck didn't look abandoned. It had no signs of damage, and there were fresh tire tracks leading up to it. Someone had been here recently. I scanned the area, but the trees were too thick to see far. I didn't like the idea of someone walking out here alone, so I shut off my engine and stepped out. The air was dead quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I walked around the truck, looking for any sign of who might have been driving it. The inside was messy, empty fast food bags, a half-drunk bottle of water, a few tools on the passenger seat. Nothing looked out of place except for the fact that the driver was nowhere to be seen. Then I noticed something on the ground a few feet away, a set of footprints leading into the woods. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking in a hurry. The ground was still soft from rain earlier in the week, and the tracks were fresh. I stared at them for a long time, debating whether I should follow them. If someone was hurt or lost, they wouldn't have a way to call for help out here. But at the same time, something about it felt off. I called out, "Hey, you out there?" Nothing. I stood there for another minute before making up my mind. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck, even though there was still plenty of daylight left, and followed the footprints. The deeper I went into the woods, the heavier the air felt. The trees blocked most of the wind, making everything unnervingly still. I kept following the tracks, stepping carefully over fallen branches and patches of damp leaves. I hadn't gone far when I spotted something ahead. A bag. It was a small backpack, half unzipped, sitting in the dirt like someone had dropped it in a hurry. I crouched down and opened it. Inside were a few snacks, a water bottle, and a folded map. No wallet, no phone, nothing that told me who it belonged to. I straightened up and looked around. The footprints kept going deeper into the woods. Something didn't feel right. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A sound in the distance. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was movement. Something or someone was out there. I stayed still, listening. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling like someone shifting their weight. Then it became clearer. Footsteps. Not running, not panicked, just walking. Slow, steady. I turned my flashlight on and aimed it ahead, but the trees were too thick to see far. The sound kept getting closer. Then it stopped. Dead silence again. I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the trees. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct told me to turn around and leave. I started backing away, moving carefully so I wouldn't make any noise. But then a snap, a branch breaking maybe 10 feet ahead of me. I turned the flashlight in that direction, and for a split second, I saw something. A figure, standing just beyond the trees, barely visible. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't even tell if they were looking at me, but they were there, standing perfectly still. I didn't wait. I turned and walked as fast as I could back toward the road. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself not to run. Running would only make noise. I made it back to my truck, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I just pulled onto the road and drove. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the woods. But I never did. The rest of the drive, I didn't stop. Not until I reached the next town, miles away. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. I thought about calling someone. Maybe the local police, but what would I even say? That I saw a truck, some footprints, and a person in the woods who never spoke or moved toward me. I never found out who that truck belonged to. A few days later, curiosity got the best of me, and I checked the local news, but there was nothing. No missing person reports, no abandoned vehicle notices, nothing at all. To this day, I don't know what I walked into out there, and I don't think I ever want to. It was the dead of winter, the kind that makes the air feel heavier, like it's pressing down on you. The kind where your breath freezes the moment it leaves your mouth, where the snow is so thick you sink past your knees with every step. I was alone, deep in the middle of nowhere, miles away from anything that resembled civilization. My truck had broken down the day before, leaving me stranded in a frozen wilderness with nothing but my pack and the supplies I had brought for what was supposed to be a routine hunting trip. I had planned for a week in the woods, deep in the north of Montana, just on the edge of an old logging road that barely saw any traffic. I liked the isolation. It gave me peace, but peace wasn't what I felt now. My phone had no signal, the radio was dead, and the only thing surrounding me was miles and miles of snow-covered forest. I had set up my small cabin, a rundown structure that had been abandoned years ago but still provided shelter. It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood-burning stove and a stiff old bed. But it was better than being outside in the cold. That first night, I lay in bed, listening to the wind howl through the trees. The walls creaked under the pressure of the storm outside, but I wasn't too worried. I had enough food to last a while, and if the weather let up, I could hike out to the nearest road in a couple of days. but something was bothering me. I had the uneasy feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. The next morning, I woke up to find tracks in the snow outside. Not animal tracks, human. They circled the cabin, stopping just at the window before disappearing back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the footprints, trying to make sense of them. The fresh snow had covered any details, but one thing was certain. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I made sure the door was locked tight, barricaded the window as best as I could, and kept my rifle close. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe lost. But I knew better. No one should have been out here, not in this weather, not this far from the main road. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me sit up. Every gust of wind sent a chill down my spine. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my rifle tight, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps stopped just outside the door, then silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening. After what felt like hours, I finally heard them again, retreating into the woods. By morning, I was done waiting. I packed what little I could carry, strapped my rifle to my back, and set off in the direction of the nearest road. It was over 10 miles away, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay here any longer. The tracks from the night before were still there, leading back into the trees, but I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. The hike was brutal. The snow was deep, the wind unforgiving. My legs burned with every step, my fingers numb despite the thick gloves I wore. But I pushed on. I had to. By midday, I felt like I was making progress, but then I saw it. More footprints. Not mine. Fresh. Whoever had been watching me wasn't at the cabin anymore. They were out here in the woods, moving in the same direction I was. I gritted my teeth and kept going, forcing myself to move faster despite the exhaustion setting in. The sun was getting lower, the temperature dropping even further. I needed to reach the road before nightfall. I pushed forward, ignoring the way my lungs burned, the way my body screamed at me to stop. Then I heard it, closer this time. Footsteps, not mine. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. I just ran. My boots sank deep into the snow. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I ran. The sound of footsteps followed, closing in. I could feel it now, the presence of something just behind me, just out of sight. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world turned dark. Then a light, faint at first, just a small glow in the distance. But it was enough. I pushed forward, my legs barely holding me up. The footsteps behind me grew fainter, then stopped altogether. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I burst onto the road, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion. Headlights, a truck. The driver pulled over, a man in his 50s, his face a mask of concern as he helped me up. I couldn't speak, couldn't explain what had happened. I just pointed back toward the woods. He looked, but there was nothing there, just darkness. He took me into town where I finally got help. I never found out who or what had been out there with me, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never went hunting alone again. It was the winter of 1998 when my uncle Robert invited me to visit his cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. He wasn't the type to extend invitations easily. He had always been a loner, preferring the silence of the woods over the company of others. I had just turned 26, fresh out of a job, and welcomed the idea of escaping to the middle of nowhere for a while. The drive itself was enough to make me question my decision. I left town in the late afternoon, and as the sun dipped below the mountains, the road stretched out into complete isolation. The last sign of civilization had been a rusted gas station with a half-broken sign swinging in the wind. The further I drove, the less I saw of anything except trees and patches of snow covering the earth. Uncle Robert's directions had been painfully simple. Follow the main road until the pavement turned to dirt. Keep going until I saw a split in the trees where an old wooden sign stood, and take that path until I reached the cabin. By the time I reached the dirt road, the sky had darkened into an inky blackness, and the cold had started to creep into my car. My headlights barely cut through the thick forest that loomed on either side. The road was rough, full of dips and sharp turns, and I could feel the tires slipping slightly on the icy patches. I kept going, gripping the wheel tightly, my breath fogging up the windshield. There was something unnerving about how silent everything was. No distant headlights, no signs of other people. Just me, the car, and the towering trees pressing in on all sides. Eventually, I spotted the wooden sign, a crooked, splintering thing with no writing left on it. I turned onto the even narrower path, the car jolting over frozen dirt. The trees closed in even tighter here, branches scratching against the sides of the vehicle like fingers reaching out. Then I saw the cabin, a squat, one-story structure with a slanted roof, barely visible in the darkness. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a single yellow light glowed in the window. I pulled up, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment. The only sound was the creaking of the trees in the wind. When I stepped out, the cold hit me like a punch. The air was sharp, heavy with the scent of pine and frozen earth. I knocked once before pushing the door open. Uncle Robert never locked his doors. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The place smelled of wood smoke and old leather. My uncle sat at the small table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked up, nodded once, then went back to staring at whatever thoughts were swimming in his head. I dropped my bags by the door and took off my coat. The place was almost exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, except for one thing. There was a rifle leaning against the wall next to him, loaded, and my uncle wasn't the type to keep a gun close unless he had a reason. I sat down across from him, stretching my frozen fingers near the fire. He didn't say much, just poured himself another drink, his jaw tight. Something was off. That night, I lay in the small bedroom, wrapped in thick blankets, listening to the wind howl outside. The trees groaned, shifting under the weight of ice and wind, and every so often, I thought I heard something else. A noise that didn't belong to the storm. A crunch, faint rustling, something moving outside the cabin. I told myself it was just an animal, a fox or maybe a deer, but the sound wasn't right. It was too slow, too deliberate. It stopped and started again, like something was pacing just beyond the reach of the firelight spilling from the window. I didn't sleep well. By morning, whatever had been out there was gone, but the unease in my stomach didn't leave. Uncle Robert was already awake, sitting in the same spot at the table, his eyes on the window. His rifle was still within reach. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands shaking slightly from the cold. "What's out there?" I finally asked, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer right away. After a long moment, he said, "Something's been watching the cabin." I didn't know what to say to that. My uncle wasn't the kind of man to get spooked easily. He had spent decades out here, living off the land, unbothered by the things that made normal people uneasy. But now his face was tight, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. I stepped outside after breakfast, my boots crunching over the frozen ground. The sun was out, making the snow glisten, but it did little to warm the air. I walked around the side of the cabin, my breath curling in the cold. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not from a deer or a bear, these were human. Barefoot, The prints were slightly melted around the edges, like they had been left sometime during the night. They circled the cabin, weaving in and out of the trees, disappearing into the forest beyond. I swallowed hard, following them a few steps before stopping myself. Something was wrong with them. The steps were uneven, almost dragging, and there was only one set. Whoever had been out here had walked in circles around the cabin for who knows how long. I backed up slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Inside, I told my uncle what I had seen. He didn't look surprised. "Yeah," was all he said. That was the last normal day. That night, the noises came back. Louder, closer. The wind carried something strange with it. A whispering sound, almost like breathing. I lay awake, gripping the hunting knife my uncle had given me when I was younger. My eyes locked on the dark window. The footsteps were back too. Slow, dragging, right outside. At one point, I heard something press against the door. A light scraping sound, as if fingers were running along the wood. And then silence. The longest silence I've ever felt in my life. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn bled through the trees. The footprints were there again, closer this time, right up to the door. We never saw who or what it was. The third night, my uncle had enough. He barely spoke, just loaded his rifle and sat by the door, waiting. I sat with him. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The cabin was deathly quiet, except for the occasional snap of wood in the fire. Then we heard it. A single knock, not frantic, not hurried, just one deliberate knock. Neither of us moved. A second knock. Uncle Robert lifted his rifle, his hands steady. I gripped the handle of my knife so hard my knuckles ached. The third knock, then nothing. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. No footsteps, no whispering, just the wind cutting through the trees. By morning, there were no footprints, nothing, as if whoever had been there had vanished. That was the last night I spent at the cabin. I packed my things without saying much, and Uncle Robert didn't stop me. I don't know if he stayed, but I never went back, and I never asked. I had always liked long drives. There was something calming about an open road, no destination in mind, just the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt cutting through the land. But that night, I learned how quickly that comfort could turn into something else entirely. It was late September, the kind of night where the air had a crispness to it but wasn't quite cold yet. I had been driving for hours, making my way through the back roads of northern Wyoming. I wasn't in a rush. I had no deadline, no obligations waiting for me at the other end. I was just driving, clearing my head. The roads out there were empty, long stretches of nothing but fields, low rolling hills, and the occasional cluster of trees. Every so often, I'd pass an old farmhouse, its lights glowing faintly in the darkness. But for the most part, it was just me, my truck, and the road. I hadn't seen another car for what felt like an hour when I noticed my gas gauge creeping toward empty. I wasn't worried yet, but I started keeping an eye out for a gas station. I had passed one earlier in the night, but that had been miles back, and I doubted I had enough fuel to make it all the way back there. I figured there had to be something up ahead. There was always something eventually. Another 30 minutes passed, and my fuel light came on. That was when I started to feel a little uneasy. I had expected to see a town by now, or at least a sign pointing me toward one. But there was nothing. Just the same dark road and the endless fields stretching out on either side. I glanced at my phone, hoping to pull up a map, but of course, I had no service. I sighed, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I'd have to just keep driving and hope for the best. A few miles later, I spotted something up ahead, a gas station sign, its light flickering in the darkness. Relief washed over me. As I got closer, I saw that it was one of those old single pump stations, the kind you'd expect to see in a town that barely existed. But at that point, I didn't care. I just needed gas. I pulled in, rolling to a stop by the pump. The station itself was nothing more than a small building, its windows dark. There were no other cars, no signs of life. I stepped out, stretching my legs before walking over to the pump. As I expected, it was an older model that required prepayment inside. I walked up to the door, peering through the glass. The inside was empty. There was a small counter, a few shelves with snacks and drinks, and a single door leading to what I assumed was a back room. I knocked on the glass. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I looked around, debating whether to wait or keep driving. I didn't have much choice, though. I was nearly out of gas, and this was the only station for miles. I decided to try the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open, stepping inside. The place had that stale smell, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. The shelves were mostly bare. A few dusty bags of chips and some expired candy bars left behind. The register sat on the counter, untouched. I called out, but my voice just echoed back at me. There was a door behind the counter, slightly ajar. Maybe the clerk was in the back. I hesitated, then stepped around the counter, pushing the door open wider. The room behind it was small, with a desk, an old metal filing cabinet, and a single chair. But no one was there. A chill ran down my spine. Something felt off. I turned back toward the main room, ready to leave when I heard something. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on gravel. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came from outside, near my truck. Slowly, I moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. Through the glass, I could see a figure standing by the pump. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. His face was obscured by the angle, but I could tell he was staring at my truck. Then, without warning, he turned his head sharply toward the station. I ducked back behind the counter, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen another person for hours, and now, in the middle of nowhere, some stranger had appeared out of nowhere. I waited, listening. The shuffling footsteps grew louder. He was walking toward the door. I had to make a decision. I could stay hidden and hope he left, or I could make a run for my truck. My keys were still in the ignition. If I was fast enough, I could start it and get out of there before he reached me. I peeked over the counter. The man was closer now, only a few feet from the door. I could see his face. Gaunt, sunken eyes, skin stretched tight over his bones. He wasn't just looking at the gas station. He was looking for something, for someone. I took a deep breath and bolted. I slammed through the door, sprinting for my truck. The man moved fast, faster than I expected. I heard him behind me, feet pounding on the pavement. I yanked the door open, diving inside. My fingers fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life just as he reached the truck. His hand slammed against the window, leaving a smear of something dark. I didn't stop to think. I threw the truck into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement, then spun it around and floored it back onto the road. I didn't look back. I drove for miles before I finally let myself breathe. My hands were shaking, my heart still hammering in my chest. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. But the road behind me was empty. Eventually, I found another station, a larger one with bright lights and other cars. I pulled in, filling up my tank with shaking hands. I debated telling someone, maybe the clerk inside, maybe the police. But what would I say? That some man had appeared in the middle of nowhere and chased me? That I had no idea where he had come from or where he had gone? Instead, I paid for my gas and kept driving. I didn't stop again until the sun came up, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The night felt like a bad dream, something distant and unreal. But when I glanced at my side mirror, I saw it. The smear on the glass, dark and dried. That was when I knew it had been real. It was late October, the kind of cold that sneaks into your bones even when you think you're dressed for it. I was working for a construction company, nothing fancy, just long hours, heavy lifting, and a paycheck that barely made the exhaustion worth it. My boss, Mark, wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't the kind of person you'd want to be stuck alone with for too long. He was the quiet type, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of quiet that made you feel like he was always thinking about something he wasn't telling you. We had been sent out to a job in the middle of nowhere. Some rich guy had bought an old property, way out in the woods, and wanted a cabin torn down before winter. The place had been sitting empty for years, and apparently he had plans to build something new. The problem was, it was miles from anything. No gas stations, no cell service, just a long dirt road that wound through the trees until you got to the cabin. The company sent us because no one else wanted to take the job. I didn't have a choice. I needed the money, and Mark wasn't the type to turn anything down, especially if it meant a fat paycheck. So we packed up the truck with tools, supplies, and enough food to last a few days. The plan was simple. Drive out there, tear the place down, and haul as much of the debris as we could back to the nearest dump. The drive itself was uneventful, but the moment we left the main road, I felt it. That uneasy, tight feeling in your chest when you know something is off, but you can't explain why. The road was rough, full of potholes, and the trees pressed in from both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight. Mark didn't say much as he drove, just kept his eyes on the road and gripped the wheel tight. I watched the GPS lose signal a few miles in. That was expected, but it didn't make me feel any better. We passed an old, rusted-out truck on the side of the road, half covered in moss, like it had been there for years. No tire tracks around it, no sign that anyone had even tried to move it. When we finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. It wasn't much to look at, just an old wooden structure, the roof sagging in places, windows boarded up. The whole thing had an abandoned feel, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't just neglected, it felt wrong, like it had been left in a hurry, like whoever was here before wanted to forget it ever existed. We unpacked the truck in silence, setting up camp a few yards away from the cabin. We had a tent, a small fire pit, and a cooler full of food. Mark wasn't one for wasting time, so as soon as we were settled, we got to work. We pried off the boards covering the windows, yanked open the rusted door, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and something else. Something sour. The inside was mostly empty. Just some old furniture, a mattress in one corner, a broken table. But there were things that didn't make sense. A plate sitting on the counter, covered in dust like it had been there for years. A pair of boots by the door, half rotted but standing upright, like someone had just taken them off. We worked until it was too dark to see, hauling debris outside and stacking it near the truck. By the time we stopped, the fire was the only thing keeping the night from swallowing us completely. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no animals, just the occasional crack of a branch somewhere out in the darkness. Mark sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while I ate a sandwich and tried not to think about how isolated we were. It wasn't just the location, it was the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. The first night passed without much incident, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us from the trees. Not an animal, something else. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The next morning, we got back to work. The faster we finished, the sooner we could leave. But as the hours passed, things started feeling off. Tools went missing, only to turn up in places we hadn't left them. A crowbar I'd used disappeared completely, even after we searched the entire site. At one point, Mark went back to the tent to grab something, only to return a few minutes later, his face pale. "The tent's ripped." That's all he said. I followed him back and saw it. 3 long, jagged tears across the fabric, like something had clawed at it. Not animal marks, though. Too precise, too deliberate. Mark didn't say anything else. He just patched it up with duct tape and went back to work. But I saw the way he kept glancing at the trees. He felt it too. By the time the sun started going down, we had most of the cabin gutted. 1 more day, maybe 2, and we'd be done. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the woods felt closer. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent. Slow, steady, deliberate. But when I unzipped the flap and shined my flashlight outside, there was nothing there. The final day was the worst. We had loaded most of the debris onto the truck and were finishing up when Mark stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" I hadn't, but the look on his face made my stomach drop. He stood still, listening, his whole body tense. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. A voice, not a scream, not a call for help. Just a voice, low and steady, speaking words we couldn't make out. I've never seen Mark scared before, but in that moment he was. "Get in the truck," he said. We left everything behind. Tools, supplies, even the tent. We just got in the truck and drove. Mark didn't say a word the whole way back. When we finally hit pavement again, I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, just a dead battery and a lingering sense of unease. We never went back to finish the job. The company tried to send another crew out there a week later, but they turned around before they even reached the site. Said the road was washed out. I don't know what we heard that day. I don't know what was out there in the woods watching us. But I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone.